Well, writing this novel was different than writing the Kite Runner because when I was writing the Kite Runner, nobody really cared. Nobody was waiting for it. I was a doctor at Kaiser, and I was, just kind of writing a story for myself, really. I wrote the Kite Runner while I was working full time, and I kept working long after the Kite Runner came out for a year and a half. So I had no intention of quitting medicine and becoming a writer. But the demands of the two careers became too heavy, and eventually I had to put one on the back burner. Well, the funny thing about the Kite Runner is that it really was kind of a slow builder. It was a word-of-mouth success, and I kept working full-time, almost full-time for a year and a half after the Kite Runner was out. And eventually it reached that tipping point, and I started spotting people reading the book in public on airplanes and that kind of thing. The inspiration for the new novel is kind of hard to point to because you never, the thing with me is I'm never aware I'm actually having an inspiration, and it's later that I recognize that that was a germ for something that I'm currently writing. So that for this novel, for my second novel, came in the spring of 2003 when I was actually in Kabul just before the Kite Runner was published. I spent 2 weeks in Kabul, and while I was in Kabul I met a lot of people, and many of them women and children. I met a lot of little girls, little boys, and a lot of women. And I spoke to them. I know one of the things in Kabul is you could just walk up to people on the street and start talking to them and just kind of learn about their life, what they've been through. And I remember meeting these women and hearing their stories of what they'd gone through during the time of the Mujahideen infighting, during the Taliban years. And I was speaking to them just to learn about what had happened in my country, because I had been away for 27 years. And I remember seeing these women walking down the street with their children and thinking about, what is their life like? What are their inner thoughts? What are their inner lives? Do they have hopes? Do they have dreams? Are they disappointed? How do they feel? And when I sat down to write my second novel, I started thinking about those women. And I can't say that either of my two main characters in Thousand Splendid Suns were based on any of those women per se, but they were based on the kind of the collective spirit of all the women that I met in Kabul in the spring of 2003. So I used those experiences to kind of create these characters, and intermittently I dipped into the stories that I had heard to create a convincing environment for these two women. Well, A Thousand Splendid Suns is really a story about Afghan women. Specifically, it's a story about these two women. And the heart of the story is about their friendship. One is a poor villager who lives in a remote area of Afghanistan. The other is the smart, educated daughter of a school teacher who has high hopes for her future. And at the heart of the novel is how circumstance and fate and tragedy brings these two women together, and how their lives intersect, and how these two women grow, and how they become very, very intimate, become very close, and the relationship evolves into a mother-daughter relationship. And it's a story about friendship, a story about commitment, a story about self-sacrifice and family, and a longing for acceptance and belonging. And the background is the upheavals in Afghanistan, which in many ways shapes the lives of these women. And so there's a chronicling of the political upheavals in Afghanistan, beginning with the Soviet invasion, going through the Civil War, the Taliban, and all the way into the post-9/11 era. My upbringing in Kabul, I have nothing but fond memory of. I mean, I grew up, I had the good fortune of being raised in Kabul during a very peaceful era. This is before the Soviet invasion. So I have very fond memories of growing up in Kabul. Very rich life socially, had a large extended family, a lot of family friends. So we had a slew of cousins and second cousins and friends and that kind of thing. Our life revolved around being with people and interacting socially with others. And Kabul at that time was a fairly thriving cosmopolitan city with kind of this active cultural and intellectual life to which my family kind of belonged. So it was very different from the image that Kabul, the images that people think of when they think of Kabul today. And even back in those days, in the 70s, when I was 7, 8, 9 years old, I'd begun to write stories. And so reading and writing was with me from a very early age. Was raised in a very literate family. My folks could recite tons of poetry. They were raised around a lot of classic poetry, and so we always had books around the house, and I was an avid reader as a child, both the Farsi literature and poetry that I read, but also later translated novels that I read in Farsi. And I began writing at a very young age, like the little boy in my first novel. Began writing short stories, small plays that I would then, quote unquote, produce for my brothers and my cousins, and we would kind of stage them for friends and family at gatherings. So it played a very central part in my life for as long as I can remember. And so I was a writer long before I decided to go into medicine later. I don't think I feel a special responsibility to inform the world about Afghanistan or my people through my novels. It's like a noble thing to say, but I don't think it's the truth. The reason is that when I've never sat down to write with any notion that lofty. I mean, I sit down because I'm intrigued by a character, by a story. In my opinion, if the current government in Afghanistan fails, it will be a disaster for both Afghanistan and the West. In Afghanistan, people will become very disillusioned with the government, and I think the country will slip back into anarchy and chaos. And in that kind of environment, then the extremists are in their element, and they can really convince people that they have something to offer that their government did not. The Taliban had a very tight control on virtually every form of artistic and cultural expression. It was, they burnt VCRs, they destroyed the Film Institute, they destroyed countless tapes of music, painting, sculptures, and they forced artists to go on the ground, in some cases literally, in cellars where they would produce these works covertly. And the most famous example of what they did to Afghan culture was the now infamous blowing up of the giant Buddhas in Bamiyan, or acts of just real cultural vandalism. And so it had a very profound effect on the Afghan artistic life. I think there's no question that the treatment of women in some Muslim countries, and I include my own, has been dismal. In Afghanistan, even in the best of times, in many parts of the country, especially in the very conservative tribal areas, women lived essentially in seclusion. A very similar lifestyle to what the Taliban preached and practiced. Well, being named the Goodwill Envoy for the UNHCR, the UN Refugee Agency, was really a great honor and a great opportunity for me, because I'd been looking for some kind of vehicle to do humanitarian work, the right position, and I never seemed to find it. But when they called, I was familiar with UNHCR and with the work that they had done in Afghanistan, which at one point had 8 million refugees living outside the country. The refugee issue was one that was very dear to my heart, being from Afghanistan. So when they contacted me, I was really honored and very happy to work with them. And my role with them, with the UN, will be to use my access to media to give voice to refugees and to speak about issues that relate to refugees and to raise public awareness about the different locations in the world where there are significant refugee problems, including Afghanistan, and these days the Darfur crisis in Sudan and in Chad. I went to Chad with the UN in January of this year. I asked them to take me on a mission, because if I was going to speak publicly about these things, I really did want to see it for myself. It was a fact-finding mission, really. I wanted to learn and see for myself the things that I was going to speak about. And it was, a truly sobering, heartbreaking experience. We went to eastern Chad, near the border with Darfur, went to 2 different refugee camps. I spoke to humanitarian staff and local authorities, but I also spoke to a lot of refugees, heard their stories. I mean, it's almost unspeakable, the things that you hear. And so, for me, it registered in a very personal, real way that the tragedy is, the magnitude of it is just astounding, and that these people's suffering is almost beyond belief. And so my hope is that I'm working now with the UN on the Aid Darfur campaign, and we're hoping to raise public awareness about this issue and to continue support for the people of Darfur.